Hello and welcome to another episode of Behind the Badge. Joining us today is Dr. Heather Williams, a distinguished psychologist specializing in trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly amongst first responders. With decades of experience in the field, Dr. Williams has dedicated her career to supporting those who have to deal with some of the most critical and challenging incidents imaginable. Police officers face extraordinary situations that can leave lasting impacts on their mental and emotional well-being. Dr. Williams works tirelessly to provide them with the tools, support, and treatment they need to process these experiences and reclaim their lives. In today's conversation, we'll explore the unique challenges first responders face, the misconceptions surrounding PTSD, and the effective strategies and therapies used to address trauma. We'll also discuss how organizations and communities can better support these heroes who put themselves on the line every day for our safety and well-being. Whether you're a first responder yourself, know someone who is, or simply want to understand more about mental health and resilience, this episode promises to offer valuable insights and practical advice. So settle in and let's speak with Dr. Heather Williams.
I'm glad to have you here today because we're here with Dr. Heather Williams, and she's a very unique lady. We've known each other for a number of years, but she has a unique task, and that is that she deals with first responders on a daily basis in the sense that she helps people deal with a lot of the trauma, the experiences they have when they're dealing with the day in and day out job of being a first responder, the critical incident response, post-traumatic stress disorder, you name it, and just helping to navigate life. She's a unique lady. The fact that she has a passion for working with first responders is commendable.
Thank you.
In and of itself.
You're my people.
But let's go back. I want to say, while I had worked with you off and on, back in 2010, I was the commander of the investigations division for the Anaheim Police Department. And we had a pretty awful case that came up. It was January of 2010. And a lady named Bessie Wyman. And I say her name because I think she needs to be remembered.
Absolutely.
Bessie Wyman was 84 years old. She lived in what many people would call an idyllic neighborhood. In fact, the retired police chief from Anaheim lived right nearby. And idyllic neighborhood, just a terrible, evil person came in, saw her sitting in the window one evening, came in, broke into the house, and brutalized her, tortured her, raped her, and eventually murdered her. And officers responded out early the next morning to check on her welfare after the suspect tried to use her credit card in the city of San Bernardino. The scene the officers came upon was horrific, and it defies description of the things that were done. And the whole neighborhood was traumatized by this. And what do you recall about the dynamic of that, and how did that inspire you to work with first responders?
Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction and for taking me back to Bessie Wyman's murder, because I agree, we need to honor that woman as a victim of crime, and it was absolutely horrendous. I know in this business we oftentimes say we couldn't make this up. Mm-hmm. It was so horrific. And so I remember getting the call from the police department explaining what had happened and the impact that it was having on the community. And at the time, I worked in victim services. I was a program director, and I also started a crisis response team in 2003. So we had started working with Anaheim as well as other departments in the county quite a bit. And our job that day after she was found was to knock on those doors of those neighbors and give them an opportunity to talk about this horrific incident. And then I remember we also had basically like a town hall meeting in a church, a local church, close to the neighborhood, where neighbors, that retired chief, law enforcement officers came to try and wrap their head around how atrocious this was and the fear that they had. So when we think about crime and victimization, it's like a ripple effect, right? You throw a rock in a pond, and the ripples and layers of people who are impacted is far-reaching. And then at that time, I had just started to debrief first responders as well. And it was Anaheim that kind of started in that process. And I remember the officer who found the victim and I had a conversation, and it was a peer support conversation before Orange County really had peer support. But I just remember, you cannot unsee what you've seen, and you cannot unsmell what you smelled, or unhear what you've heard, and as we all know, and that was an incident that most people will never forget.
Let's talk a little bit about that whole idea of peer support.
Okay.
Back in 2010, it was just beginning to get traction amongst a lot of departments around the country. What does that look like for the person who doesn't really understand what peer support is?
So today, fast forward 14 years, I am really excited to report that most departments, at least in Southern California area, have some kind of peer support program or wellness program. So it's actually graduated to more of looking at holistic wellness, right? Body, mind, spirit, relationships, looking at wellness as a whole. But the peer support component is a group of peers within a law enforcement department who get specialized training to be there to support their peers through the trials and tribulations of life. It can be personal stressors, it can be professional incidents or critical incidents, but they're there to guide, direct, listen, assess, and help be part of the village to take care of law enforcement personnel. A big part of peer support too, in my humble opinion, is they are leaders within the organization who are validating and normalizing the human element in this job.
I mean, I started the job in 1980, and pretty much it was unheard of.
Right.
You'd been involved in might be a traumatic or critical incident. Our peer support was at the local police cop bar.
Right.
And
The watering hole.
Yeah, the watering hole. We only worked 8-hour shifts, so you didn't have to rush home right away. But there was a sense of debriefing that occurred while informal.
Choir practice.
Yeah, choir practices that probably not the healthiest way of dealing with things, but at least they were dealt with. Let's talk about critical incidents. The average person who is not a first responder experiences maybe a handful of critical incidents in their lifetime.
I actually read a statistic that, according to the FBI law enforcement bulletin, that in the general population, they may experience 2 to 3 in their lifetime. By the time a law enforcement officer retires, they have responded to over 200.
And those are just the critical incidents.
Right.
We're talking homicides, aggravated assaults where people have been severely injured, robberies, sex abuse, child abuse, all those other things. But I mean, some of the things that would wear me out, it's a hot August night and you're going to your 4th family fight call of the night. People are yelling, there's alcohol involved. And at the end of the day, you are just physically and emotionally drained from having to be a peacekeeper in these situations over and over again. And you do lose patience. You do sit there, but the average person doesn't have to deal with that kind of stuff day in and day out.
They have no idea what kind of conflict goes on in the community that law enforcement shows up to day in and day out. And a big part of why compassion fatigue is an issue within law enforcement is because of those calls that they go on over and over again. You call 911, you want help, we get there, we can't help you. We can't take control of the situation other than separating you or helping you with an EPO or giving you a resource or getting you into a shelter or whatever it is. But then that victim doesn't follow through, or there's fear, or but I love him, or whatever the answers are at the door. And so caring and wanting to make a difference and then continuing to go to the same things where you can't fix it and you can't take control gets really frustrating. And so then there's something called compassion fatigue, where it's basically your give a shit meter is on empty.
Yeah. Well, I think anybody who's had to deal with family members suffering from addiction.
Yes.
There's some compassion fatigue.
Yeah.
You can only give so much support, and a person whose job it is to deal with this day in and day out, I can totally see that. There's impatience, there's frustration that sets in, and then you bring this stuff home. because you've had a heck of a day and you may have a spouse, a partner, a family member, a friend that doesn't really understand.
There's no way for anybody to fully understand because they're not in your shoes. They don't show up and respond to these things or deal with the tragedies of life on a day-to-day basis. But one of the things that I have tried really hard over the last 14 years between my peer support life and my now clinical being a licensed psychologist is to teach communication strategies to the first responders, to the officers, to the dispatchers, so that they can get the support that they need at home and help their families understand what they need to decompress as part of their transition from work to home. So I call it a transition plan, and I talk a lot about the nervous system and how the nervous system is worked up through the adrenaline and through the stressful situations, right? You're up and down throughout your shifts and throughout your day. And when you leave to go home, do you check in on yourself? Do you know where you're at in your body? Are you hungry? Are you irritable? Are you thirsty? Are you tired? Do you have capacity to listen to one more person talk to you? And usually the answer is no.
When you sit there and you can think of the things the officers go through day in and day out, but you brought up a point. It's experiential.
Mm-hmm.
You will not know what it's like to be a first responder, especially in law enforcement, because you've never been in those shoes. Then there's the frustration that comes when the public judges the profession, that we could have done better, you could have done this, you could have done that. Fully accepting the fact that they're human, but at the same time not understanding what it's like to be in those shoes.
Or understand policy and procedure as it relates to use of force rules,
Mm-hmm.
right? Making comments like, well, why didn't you shoot him in the knee? And not understanding that's not where they aim to shoot.
Yeah.
That's not part
Well, I tell people that it's not easy to put out handcuffs on somebody who doesn't want them put on. The average person who is making these decisions or forming those opinions, is a better way of saying it, has never been in a physical fight, probably never shot a gun. They're basically judging what they think the officer should have done on a media portrayed image, and that every officer should be an expert in jiu-jitsu and be able to tie people up in a pretzel very quickly. And quite frankly, as a 5'7", 150-pound cop, when I studied, that wasn't my go-to. I find it riding on people's backs quite a bit because they were all bigger than I was. But when we look at the officers, what are some of the common things that you as a mental health professional have to deal with them when they're going about and they come to you?
So a lot of times, because the stigma was very present when I first started doing the peer support work, is people would be, I call it like down the rabbit hole. So if you can picture like a spiraling hole, and at the very bottom is this dark, desperate, hopeless place. So many guys and gals would be down at that hole, hopeless and helpless, depressed, anxious, trying to figure out, okay, I had to get all the way down here to ask for help, because the stigma of asking for help in law enforcement was, well, you suck it up and you move on. Asking for help is weakness. But over the last 10 years, I'll say, after working at the Orange County Sheriff's Department and being a regional peer support coordinator in 2014 and watching the culture shift over the years of being there and working with other departments throughout the county, I watched that shift. And I think that instead of being all the way down at the rabbit hole now, people are about halfway down, screaming for help, and some still are down at the bottom. But what I will tell you is that generationally, I've had guys in their 20s who say, you know what, I meet them at the academy. They're not even on the job yet. They're not even 10-8 in the field. And they're knocking on my door saying, can we talk? I just want to make sure that I take care of my mental health through my career. So you have generational differences. This generation is very resourceful. They have cell phones. They know how to access resources or look up things that they don't understand. Where for my generation growing up, your generation, we didn't have access to those resources where we could do it confidentially. We'd have to go to someone to ask for help. And then there was stigma attached to that. And so even though I was never a sworn police officer, working in victim services, responding to critical incidents, and having law enforcement look at me as, well, you're strong, you deal with our stuff. No, I didn't tell anybody that I was also experiencing a lot of the same acute stress reactions and things that you guys deal with at the same time, because I'm dealing with people on their worst day.
And a lot of these behaviors aren't manifested right away.
No, they
Yeah.
come later.
It's cumulative.
It can be cumulative. And what I've also learned is through emotional intelligence and awareness teaching, like so many of my classes now are about, I want to empower you to know yourself well enough that when you go to a critical incident, I want you to be able to check in on yourself after.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be at the end of your shift, it could be on your first day off, or it can be right when you leave that situation, is to do what I call a mental check-in.
Mm-hmm.
And that mental check-in is simple. I will ask myself, where am I at with this situation? And I will think about different irritability, sadness, frustration. Am I sick to my stomach? I'm noticing acute stress reactions in myself. And there have been a few really difficult cases over the summer involving child deaths that I've gone to respond to and debrief, and they are just tragic.
Mm-hmm.
And teaching people to say, okay, I'm not okay with this. And if I'm not okay, then who are my go-tos? Who's safe to talk to about it?
Mm-hmm.
Because the best way to process trauma and critical incidents is to tell the story and to be able to process it correctly so our brain can file it away right.
And it's so difficult to tell that story because you can't share it with just anybody, because most people would sit there with their jaw dropped, wondering what the heck is going on here, because some of the stuff is just pretty horrific.
Yeah.
I mean, late in my career, in fact, I was already a captain. I was the first to respond to a hospital where a 2-year-old had been beaten to death by their caregivers. And the doctor says, well, here he is, and there's the poor battered bruised kid. To this day, I regret I didn't have to be there. I just happened to be there when the call came out. I go, I'll step in. And you sort of just compartmentalize it and just say, I don't need to go there. The only time I really think about it is when I'm talking to peers.
Right.
Who
trigger those memories.
Who trigger those memories. Do you remember when?
Yes.
That kind of thing. And
you said something really important I want to address to the listeners, and that's compartmentalization. That's not a bad thing. That's a survival skill in this job. And whether it's the dispatcher who takes the call, or the officer in the field, or the investigator, or even someone like myself who listens to this stuff day in and day out or responds or whatever, we all have to compartmentalize the experience so that we can be present to do our jobs. So that, to me, I see nothing wrong with that. I think the difference now, though, is for everyone listening is, what do you do with that once you have compartmentalized? Can you pull it back out? And I picture like this visual of yanking it back out of our head and saying, okay, I gotta face you. How am I responding to you? Am I struggling? Am I irritable? Do I want to go home and hug my kids because I'm projecting this death onto my own family? It's having that awareness to say, okay, I've compartmentalized to do my job, and now in order to take care of my mental health, my relational health, my physical health, then I need to face it and see how I'm doing with it.
Probably the most significant critical incident an officer will face in their career is an officer-involved shooting.
Without a doubt.
Where somebody has lost their life. Yeah, or a child death. What's the dynamic of that? Because it's not just the moment of the incident, but this thing is going to go ongoing for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be investigations. You're going to be interviewed over and over again by different entities, your department, district attorneys, maybe this California Attorney General. It's going to inevitably end up in a civil suit at some point, and it could be a year-long process to get through this stuff. And it's amazing to me how officers manage to get through it without suffering some harm.
Well, I will tell you that this has been a very busy year for officer-involved shootings. I have quite a few clients that I talk to throughout Southern California, and there's no doubt that there's impact in being in a shooting, and it varies. Most times the officers do not have a problem with their tactical decision making and the threat that presented itself to have to do the shooting. It's a frustration of the bad guy, suspect, right, puts them in that situation where then they have to shoot to neutralize the threat and preserve life, either that of themselves, the community, or their partners. And so logically, it's textbook. They did exactly what they needed to do in that moment to rectify the situation safe. But what I've heard more and more of is it depends on what they're going through in their personal life. It also depends on how the department treats them, and their perception of support is huge. So what happens in the aftermath of a shooting is just as important, if not more important, than what happens during the shooting.
Mhm.
And if departments have a solid response, peer support is there to sit with them. What departments are doing right now, which I love, Chino did this, Fullerton, even Irvine did this on their last shooting, is they have everybody in the same room, so nobody's isolated.
Mhm.
And you have peer supports in there, there's investigators going in and out. It's just part of a process now, and not people are sitting in a dark room by themselves thinking, why am I being treated like a suspect? So I'm seeing that change, and that's been really good. I also see that when you have peer support following up, you bring in your mental health clinician. Like, I show up right as soon as I get called, I'm there, and then I can debrief them one at a time in an office that's private, and they have an opportunity to have the attorney-client privilege as well as the therapist-client privilege. And there's continuity of care, and there's follow-up, not just the week of or the day of, but for that entire year until that case is done. Because that is a lot of the unknown, the uncertainty that causes anxiety in a lot of officers after they've been in a shooting.
And there's angst. I mean, basically, you're in a civil court if there's a settlement, and you're going to have to go to trial. And it's
Worst case scenario, yeah.
it's every bit as bad as a criminal trial,
Yep,
where you're sitting there and you're being judged on your decision making, your judgment,
yep.
and everything else. One of the things that I think has been exacerbated since my time as a police officer is the amount of public sentiment towards police that's magnified through social media.
Right.
And people who've never been a cop in their lives are passing judgment. And what you see is just this overwhelming negativity towards police in general. How has that impacted the mental health of some of the officers who go out day in, day out?
Some don't care. Some are able to just put a face on and be like, it's not personal. Let them think what they want to think. And then for some, it's like, you don't know me. Why are you judging me? You know what I represent, which is authority and the law, but you don't know me as a person, so kind of how dare you?
Mm-hmm.
And that can lead to increased anxiety. That can lead to a hypervigilance that goes beyond just the vigilance of being in law enforcement and officer safety issues and things like that. It can make people more concerned. I'll even use the word a little more paranoid.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean that in a psychosis state, but just like, hey, kids, don't tell your friends or teachers that I'm in law enforcement kind of thing.
Yeah, I have seen that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a generational police officer. My father was an officer for the city of Santa Ana. And he had no problem living in the city where he worked.
Right.
And people greeted him and said hi to him down the street. And then later on, when I became a police officer, I was actually working narcotics, and somebody found out where I lived and was actually watching my house. And
Oh my gosh.
so we sold the house the next day. And people think, well, we've got to get more cops that are community-based. And quite frankly, we don't want to live in the same city where we work because we feel like we're always working.
Yes.
The
And
hypervigilance.
You know too much.
Yes. And every time he drives up, I remember being there for this. I was there for this. I was there for that. I love living where I live because I have no idea what's going on.
Ignorance can be bliss.
But let's talk a little bit about the partners of the people who are involved in law enforcement, because traditionally there has always been this stereotype that police officers suffer a significantly higher divorce rate than the general public. Whether that's true or not anymore, I don't know, but that stereotype still sticks. And sometimes a lot of people blame it on the job.
Well, there's no doubt that working in law enforcement, that doing shift work, getting called out, being on call 24/7, just depending on the position, right? Getting phone calls in the middle of the night, and being on command staff, just there's always a need. And so being at work is oftentimes less balanced than being at home. And so I was teaching yesterday, and I did this with my hands, and I said, a lot of you don't have work-life balance. And maybe your perception or expectation is that it's 50-50. But when you work in public safety, it can do this. And so what you do with this time, the intentionality, the relationships, the communication, the time away, when you can turn off your phone, that becomes really powerful. And when significant others can acknowledge that my loved one just got called out, he's going to miss the birthday or she's going to miss the anniversary or whatever's going on, but I know we have a day coming up where we can do all that because I know that I matter to him or her. And so, yes, I think the divorce rate is probably anecdotally higher, but in our general population, just in the United States, the divorce rate is over 50% for the first marriage. And so then you throw in cultural elements of law enforcement, infidelity, I'm just going to throw it out there, long hours, shift work, not communicating at home, not connecting with your loved ones. It can cause problems in relationships. And resentment builds, and people aren't taught how to communicate effectively when they're in this high stress, adrenaline filled, flooded moment in their own personal life. And so what people do is they avoid conflict, or they shove it like they do their trauma, shove it, and eventually people implode or explode. And that happens in people's relationships. So learning to navigate communication from the minute they even sign up for law enforcement is important. In fact, at the Sheriff's Department, I teach the LD-14, which is the emotional wellness course. But in the evening, we bring in the family members and loved ones of the recruits. And then my husband and I, who's captain of the Sheriff's Department, we teach together the family members and just kind of talk about some of those communication strategies or talk about how to navigate stressors, because we're trying to prevent people from having to go through divorce. We've both been through it, and it's terrible. So I think that's a big part of the significant other piece, is for us to not ignore them. And in fact, last weekend, through Premier First Responder Psychological Services, we started Blue Line Significant Other Wellness Group.
Okay.
So
that's awesome.
That's something I should give to you to Michelle.
For those of you watching, we'll go ahead and post a link to that in our website here. The other thing is that the stressors just aren't on the street. Sometimes just the internal organization, and whether you're a supervisor, middle manager, or senior command staff, the dynamics within a police organization, having been there, are extremely stressful.
Yeah.
The decision making that has to be taking place, the balancing the needs of the community with the needs of the department, the political influences, the economic influences, and how much money are we going to have to do this or that.
Yeah.
It's a whole different dynamic trying to deal with that stuff.
It is, and I will tell you that when people come to me for stress, so much of it is the organizational stress and the bureaucracy and the politics and some toxic personalities that may enter into any workplace, right? They're going to be those people. And so helping people navigate through those difficult personalities, giving them a safe place to not be judged and vent, but also give people strategies for coping as well as conflict resolution. I do a lot of discussions with people on being assertive, and people automatically think being assertive means being aggressive. And it's not. It's completely different. And so helping people communicate within the organization, to cope within the organization, can be even more powerful than the people on the outside.
Yeah, having been a member of command staff, I can tell you that it is stressful.
Yeah.
It's oftentimes you're making decisions about people's lives.
Yep.
This was their career, and the decision they could very much impact them, not only them, but their families.
Yeah.
And everything else. So, sometimes we get painted by the troops as uncaring, but we understand. And we have to look at the organization. What's for the best for the organization or the profession of policing.
Right. And I would think that post 2020 and everything that people lived through, that has to be looked at under a microscope even more than even before.
Oh, I think everything is looked at and judged twice and looked at over and over again. All the decision making that takes place, and whether it's through lawsuits, whether it's through social media or other places. The other thing that is different than what you've seen in the past, if you get involved in an incident where your name gets released to the media, it's there forever.
Yeah.
If I wanted to look up something at a certain police department, certain names will pop up in a critical incident, officer involved shooting, the use of force, a major crime.
Yeah, the privacy is not there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the body-worn cameras that show what happened, or at least
played over and over and over again, and it just doesn't go away.
No, but also the impact on the officer when they have to watch that BWC, and they get to see what transpired, because part of being a critical incident are short-term limitations to right tunnel vision, auditory issues, things like that, and a lot of it goes to what's called post-traumatic amnesia, where people don't remember all the moving parts of a critical incident because your brain is focused on survival. And so they watch their BWC like after a shooting, and they're like, okay, I feel better now. Right? I understand, like in a witnessing officer, why I couldn't shoot, what my backdrop was, or where that other officer was. So it really helps in a positive way create the gaps in memory and be able to make sense of decision making. So the second guessing is less.
You brought up something that a lot of the public doesn't understand. And why does it take so long to interview an officer after a shooting? We have to wait for the recollection to be accurate, because post-traumatic amnesia is real. The adrenaline is still there. The cortisone is still running through your body.
Yep.
And what you think you saw may not be a reality until everything is settled down and you see what's happening. We see more being invested in the well-being of officers in the department, the strategies that are going on there, but that's not true across the board, is it?
No.
Yeah. Different departments, because of budgetary reasons or just a lack of priority, would probably be a better way. Just haven't really understood that if an employee's mental health is well, it reduces risk, it reduces exposure, it increases longevity, it
can mitigate liability,
or just that organizational stress you talk about. It can mitigate a lot of that organizational stress as well. If command staff, and especially chiefs, can understand that, if at least people understand that I care about your individual well-being as well as the department well-being.
And that is true. I will say that I was on a Zoom meeting with someone from North Carolina who works more in the psychiatric nursing world, and she's checked with law enforcement agencies there for peer support training and different things, and there's nothing. She's consulting with me because she goes, California just does it better. And I'm like, I think you're right. I mean, it doesn't mean every department throughout California has a program, but I know they're trying. And I do think we're the leaders when it comes to resiliency and wellness and peer support programs, and recognizing that if we take care of our mind the way we take care of our body, that we're collectively going to be better.
Well, the idea is to get people to thrive in this profession.
Absolutely. Not get to 30 years and then fall apart.
And that is a very real statistic, isn't it?
It is. It's really interesting to me. I've been teaching a retirement summit where I bring in a financial advisor, and then I do an hour, and then we have a panel for workers' comp attorney. And I basically take them through a timeline. And the timeline starts with 2 bad days and I'm out, right? I'm 50 and I'm gone. And then over the course of the first month, it's like I still feel like I'm on vacation. I'm traveling, I get to spend time with family I haven't seen in a while. I'm going to doctor's appointments that I've been skipping out on, things like that. And then around the 3 to 6 month period, all of a sudden, depression, post-traumatic stress symptoms are kicking up. And what's happening is the brain starts to slow down and rest and relax. And all of a sudden, and I heard this term somewhere, the parade of faces show up. And those parade of faces are those traumas that accumulated through their career that they shoved away and they compartmentalized and they never looked at again. And that's why I really try to teach people that avoidance is the precursor to a post-traumatic stress injury. And we now have brain scans that show that it can show up as an injury, that PTSD can show up as an injury. And if it can show up that something's wrong, there's also brain scans that show how we can heal it.
You talk a lot, and I have even mentioned that we were talking about a career, but it's actually more than just a career. is the longevity after career. We all want to be a burden to our retirement plan at some point.
Yep. Take advantage fully.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I want somebody up in my retirement plan office sitting there going, why the heck is this guy still alive?
Why am I still paying him?
Yeah, but, and I, it's sad to say my father did not last long after his police career. And he got Parkinson's, but whether that was from exposure to something on the job or something else, it was just, he actually worked beyond his retirement. He could have left 6 years earlier.
Oh, well.
But he loved what he did. And
How do you argue with them, though?
yeah, you love
You
what
love
you did.
what you do.
But I think part of it is the ability to see life outside of just,
Have purpose and an identity outside
There you go.
of your law
Identity.
enforcement. Absolutely. And purpose.
Mhm.
We thrive as human beings on having purpose and an identity.
and I mean, I've always looked at it this like, but I'm helping people. I'm doing good.
I have purpose.
Yes.
Mhm.
And this is a great way to do it. I mean, whether it's helping somebody whose car just got broken into or everything else, but your whole identity gets wrapped up in what you do. But, I'm here to tell you there is life and life abundant after this profession.
Absolutely. Which is another reason why addressing people before they retire, like 3 years out, start thinking about these things. I created a one-page handout for people who are like 3 years out, 1 year out, to say, I know you've looked at your finances and how you're going to feel financially after retirement, but here are some things that maybe you haven't considered, like what's your family's expectation? What's your expectation? Now you're going to be home in their space that they're used to having you not there.
One thing, and you probably know better than anybody, is there is not a stereotypic personality for a cop. They're as diverse as any other group of people.
Yes, yeah. The only stereotype I would say, or it's not a stereotype to me, it's based on my 20-something years of experience in this field, is that type A.
Well, yeah.
Right, the type A personality, hard charger.
We're not Labrador retrievers. Our personality, and they picked us. They picked people because of this. They run towards the danger. They don't run.
Sheepdog versus sheep.
Yep.
Yep.
They run towards it, and they get involved in the middle of things and everything else. And we screen for that
Yeah,
as we bring people on board. Because number one, we don't want you to crash and burn in a job you're going to hate.
right.
But we want people who lean into their discomfort and their fear.
Yeah, face it head on.
And there's a public expectation that we do that.
Right,
In fact, when we fail to do that, there's judgment like crazy.
absolutely.
Yeah. But Heather, as always, Dr. Williams.
Heather is perfect.
Yeah, I knew you long before you were Heather. Dr. Williams.
It's all right. I always tell people I wasn't a doctor till I was 45, so I just know myself as Heather. And I'm good.
It was great speaking with you, and we'll have to speak again. And
Yes.
thank you for sharing a lot of your insights with our audience here at Behind the Badge.
Honored as always, Joe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody be safe who's listening.
All right, please.